recognize Indigenous Persons Day, a day to lift up and recognize the people, cultures, and history of the Indigenous peoples of these lands. I wish to start by thanking Julia Keefe for bringing her music that is important to her and her Nez Perce traditions to our community observance today. It would be so wonderful if we were at a place where we could just celebrate the knowledge of all the different cultures that surround us and have always surrounded us. But we do not yet get to be in that day because we are still trying to undo the history. And so many people are still trying to find and reclaim and rebuild their cultures. Because the timing of this day is also about undoing the history that most of us learned growing up. For most of my life, and probably for most of yours, this has been Columbus Day. As we heard from our kids earlier, it was the day of the discovery of America. Even though my history class also taught that the true first discoverer was Amerigo Vespucci. But that was also wrong. So part of the observance is to break through the lies about discovery, the lies about conquest, tales told by those who came to conquer the people or to take the land and somehow justify their taking. These are the lies that most of us were taught as history. And today there are battles still raging in school boards and states all over this country over the teaching of history, because that shapes the stories that we tell each other, what we believe about ourselves, our families, those of us who are here in America about this nation, but also about how we fit in the world or how we don't fit. Here in this room, each person has a different story of how they came to be here, and not just in this room, but on this Zoom. How they're placed in this world because of their ancestors. Though there are some who are here through their very own choices, we all have different paths. Some among us may be from Indigenous communities with histories that have been hidden by the dominant history, and are now reclaiming and sharing those stories. Some of us traveled to these lands recently and have a relative newcomer's connection to the story of America and these lands. Others among us were brought here by force as captives or by desperation, fleeing grave threats. There are some who came seeking opportunities from poverty and injustice in other places. And some among us had ancestors who believed a story they were told about a new land and a chance to make a new world. Some of us came to a land where that land had already been built. And others come from families like mine that made this fake new world by taking the land and hiding their taking in the myth called America. Because I come from one of the early settler families, before there was an America, at least on my dad's side. My younger sister has been working on the family genealogy, both an eye toward the way colonizers told their stories in this land. Each generation of our family moved to an area that was considered for most of this nation new land. We've been here long enough that new land included New Hampshire, Vermont, and Connecticut as great new frontiers. But that truly means lands newly taken from the people who held those lands and lived there first. The lands taken from the Indigenous people. My sister and I started building a list of all the names of all the groups our family was part of displacing. But the list is far too long. It would be taken too long to even share an abridged list. Just know that I stand here on Indigenous Persons Day as a descendant of the people who came here and took the lands, and fought and killed people to take those lands, who negotiated treaties and broke them, all to force people from these lands and then erase their memories. I share this not to reflect on my family, but to reflect on the history most of us have been taught, that my family was part of the making and writing, and some of your families may have been as well. When we speak of the removal of Indigenous persons, the removal occurred after fighting, after lies, in the face of force and the threat of extermination. And while trying to remove the people, those who built this new nation also sought to erase their culture, their history, and their identities. I was rereading sections of Ronald Tataki's A Different Mirror, A History of Multicultural America, as part of my preparation for this reflection. I was struck again by the way those in the English colonies had so many different ideas about how to deal with the Indigenous peoples. One was, of course, to gain new lands, because as more people came or were born, more lands were needed. Otherwise, they might starve. At least that's what they thought, and that's what they said. Another way was to, quote unquote, civilize the quote unquote savage. The first people could theoretically stay if they could be taught to live as the new colonizers, if they became Christians, spoke new languages, wore new clothes, lived in the new style houses, engaged in commerce, and gave up everything in their old traditions, then they could stay. But while this was cited as an ideal, any failure to conform would be enough to remove the people anyway. And has also set up a pattern for plans and projects for future generations, the elimination of Indigenous culture altogether. You may have heard recently about the excavations at the boarding schools in Canada, whose lands have finally been searched, when stories of horrific abuse at these required government schools for children of the First Nations, as they are called in Canada, were finally investigated. They have found at far too many schools hundreds of bodies at each school, so the number is really in the thousands, of children who died in those schools. But even without the abuse and the deaths, the goal of the schools itself was terrible: to take the children from their parents before they could learn their language and culture and teach them the new people's language and culture. And these schools did not exist only here in Canada. They existed here in America. They were federally established and funded schools. They were largely run by religious groups. And this includes the American Unitarian Association, which established multiple boarding schools for the purpose of acculturating the children. That means to remove their culture, to introduce them to the dominant white culture. I will not detail the full history here, though the longest existing school under Unitarian administration seems to be the Bond School in Montana, which sought to educate, quote unquote, the Ute children to white culture. And this was not a short-lived goal nor a fringe one. In 1909, then AUA President Samuel Atkins Elliott was appointed to the Board of Indian Commissioners by then President Taft. He gave speeches such as, this one hurts, "From the scalping knife to the can opener," arguing how important it was to assimilate the native peoples to the white culture. And these schools actually grew during the 20th century, existing into the late 1960s. So this is not a wrong of a long ago past. I must thank the Harvard Square Library for making so many parts of the Unitarian Universalist historical record available digitally. I invite anyone who wished to explore it. I also thank the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition for sharing so much of this history to help raise awareness of what must come before there can be healing for the communities and families harmed if such healing is possible. Because observing Indigenous Peoples Day means building new historical narratives to battle that traditional discovery myth. This is part of the work, not just our congregation, but the UUA and the Unitarian Universalist congregations has taken together as part of the work of dismantling the systems that those before us helped build. Just as I come from a settler family, our Unitarian forefathers and foremothers were part of writing our traditional American story. They were part of the real history, including the many parts we were deliberately not taught. And worship services like ours today seek to center these hidden stories, the hidden people, the Indigenous peoples who have been here all along, their cultures, not just incidentally forgotten, but were tried to be erased, and to find ways to rewrite a shared history that includes their history. And in fact, of course, as a reminder, that is also our history, because our community does, as always, include people from Indigenous backgrounds as well. There is still so much to be done to bring more truth to our shared history, to remember that so many different people are part of this we, and to ensure that those who seek to continue to tell the old stories do not get to control what is taught. One action to be taken to support Indigenous people in their long struggle for recognition is to engage in the struggle over what children are taught now and in the future. There are many ways to support the Indigenous pursuit of justice in different spheres. I celebrate whenever I see communities working together to find a parcel of land in their community that they can return to the people whose land it was. Some among us have been part of supporting those who are struggling to keep land safe from mining, from exploration, from development. Some of us have engaged in fair trade with areas of the Americas with large Indigenous populations so they can make true livings without doing harm or suffering the harm of those who wish to keep them in their quote-unquote place. There are many small actions that can help support the myriad of different groups across these lands who are just seeking to build their communities, to strengthen their communities, and share their story. At the same time, it can seem impossible to heal or make amends for a wrong as great as has been committed against the people of this land. And it may be, but seeking to support the truth, to share the stories, to struggle to spread the truth and keep it in our minds when we face the myths, and to start to celebrate these cultures that we have largely ignored. These are steps in a journey we cannot predict, because we can never predict the end of a journey from its start. Because as we tell this new history, we allow those who follow to build a new future. And we cannot imagine what that community may look like, and how our different stories, our different cultures may be lifted up in a world we cannot even imagine. So it's a day of somber reflection, but it's also a celebration that we can learn, we can share, we can grow if we're willing to do the work that comes along that journey. So may it be.